Is this what you call it? You raised her in poverty. You could not even afford to send her to college without a scholarship. You wore the same clothes for years. You drove a car that barely ran. And now you stand here in my world at my wedding, and you talk about love. The ballroom fell silent. 250 guests, dressed in their finest, watched as the crystal glass tilted in his hand. The red wine, a vintage worth more than most people earned in a month, cascaded down the old man's shoulders, soaking through his worn but carefully pressed suit jacket. The stain spread across his chest like blood. Thomas Bennett, 29 years old, heir to a real estate empire worth $3 billion, stood there with a cold smile playing on his lips. The old man, Richard Hayes, 62 years old, didn't move. He just stood there, wine dripping from his gray hair onto the marble floor, his weathered hands trembling slightly at his sides. His daughter, Emily, froze in her white wedding gown, her bouquet slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a soft thud. The silence stretched. Someone gasped. A woman in the back row began to cry. And Thomas, looking at his new father-in-law with disgust written across his perfect features, said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. You should have known your place before you walked into my world, old man. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Hayes had been a teacher for 37 years. Not the kind of teacher you forget, but the kind whose voice stays with you long after you leave his classroom. He taught high school mathematics in a small district in Ohio, where the buildings were old and the textbooks were older. He had married young, to a woman named Margaret who had eyes like summer rain and a laugh that could fill a room. They had one daughter, Emily, born on a cold November morning in 1996. Margaret died when Emily was 14. Cancer, the doctors said. It took her in 6 months. Richard raised Emily alone after that, working summer jobs driving trucks and painting houses to make sure she never went without. He never remarried. Some men only love once in a lifetime, and Richard was one of those men. Emily grew up watching her father sacrifice everything for her. She saw him skip meals so she could eat. She saw him wear the same 3 shirts for years, so she could have new clothes for school. She saw him smile through exhaustion, through loneliness, through the kind of quiet suffering that leaves no scars on the outside but changes everything on the inside. When Emily graduated high school with honors, Richard cried. When she got a full scholarship to Boston University, he cried again. She studied business administration, worked part-time at a coffee shop near campus, and dreamed of one day making enough money to buy her father a new house. She wanted to give him the life he had never been able to give himself. That was where she met Thomas Bennett. It was during her senior year, at a networking event for business students. Thomas was there as a guest speaker, representing his family's company, Bennett Properties. He was handsome, confident, charming in the way that wealthy men often are when they have never been told no. He noticed Emily immediately. She was different from the other women he usually met. Women who wore designer clothes and carried themselves with practiced elegance. Emily wore a simple black dress she had bought at a thrift store, and when she spoke, she looked people directly in the eyes. Thomas was intrigued. He asked for her number. She hesitated, but eventually said yes. Their relationship moved quickly. Thomas showered her with gifts, expensive dinners, weekend trips to places she had only seen in magazines. Emily was overwhelmed by it all, but she was also falling in love. Thomas was attentive, thoughtful, and he made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered. But there was something else, something she noticed but chose to ignore. Thomas never asked about her family. When she mentioned her father, he would change the subject. When she showed him pictures of her childhood home, he barely glanced at them. It was as if that part of her life did not exist in his world. 6 months into their relationship, Thomas proposed. It was at a 5-star restaurant overlooking the harbor, and the ring was so large Emily was afraid to wear it. She said yes, tears streaming down her face, and Thomas kissed her in front of everyone. That night, she called her father to tell him the news. Richard listened quietly, and when she finished, he said something that made her pause. "Baby girl, does he know where you come from? Does he know who you are?" Emily laughed it off. "Of course, Dad. He loves me. But Richard did not laugh. Love is not enough, Emily. Respect is what keeps love alive. The wedding was planned for June, at the Grand Bellingham Hotel in Manhattan. Thomas insisted on paying for everything. Emily wanted something smaller, something simpler, but Thomas would not hear of it. You are going to be a Bennet, he said. Bennets do not have small weddings. Emily's father was invited, of course, but as the wedding drew closer, Emily began to notice how Thomas spoke about him. Is your dad going to wear a suit? Thomas asked one evening. He does not own a tuxedo, does he? Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. He'll wear a suit, Thomas. A nice one. Thomas smirked. Well, just make sure he doesn't embarrass us. Emily wanted to say something, to defend her father, but she did not. She told herself it was just nerves, that Thomas did not mean it the way it sounded. But deep down she knew. She knew and she said nothing. The day before the wedding, Richard arrived in New York. He took a bus from Ohio because he could not afford a plane ticket, and the journey took 14 hours. When he finally arrived at the hotel, he was exhausted, his joints aching, his face drawn. Emily met him in the lobby, and when she saw him, she burst into tears. Dad, you should have let me buy you a ticket. Richard smiled and hugged her. I am fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to be here. That evening, there was a rehearsal dinner at the hotel restaurant. Thomas's family was there, his mother, Victoria Bennet, a woman with silver hair and a cold, appraising gaze, his father, Charles Bennet, a man who spoke in numbers and rarely smiled, and Thomas's younger sister, Olivia, who was the only one who seemed genuinely kind. Richard sat at the end of the table, quiet and out of place. He watched as the Bennets talked about business deals, real estate investments, vacation homes in the Hamptons. They did not ask him any questions. They did not even look at him. At one point, Victoria turned to Emily and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, Darling, where did you say your father worked? Emily hesitated. He was a teacher, Mrs. Bennet. Victoria's smile was thin. Oh, how charming. And does he still teach? He is retired, Richard said quietly. Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. Well, that must be nice. To have so much free time. The wedding day arrived. The sky was clear, the air warm, and the ballroom of the Grand Bellingham Hotel was decorated with white roses and crystal chandeliers. Emily looked beautiful in her gown, her hair swept up, her face glowing. Richard stood in the hallway outside the bridal suite, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He had bought a new suit for the occasion, spending money he did not have, because he wanted to look presentable. He wanted to make his daughter proud. When Emily stepped out, she saw her father standing there, and for a moment, everything else faded away. You look perfect, Dad, she whispered. Richard's eyes filled with tears. No, baby girl. You do. The ceremony was beautiful. Richard walked Emily down the aisle, his hand trembling as he held hers. When the officiant asked, Who gives this woman to be married? Richard said, in a voice that cracked with emotion, I do. He kissed Emily's cheek and stepped back, taking his seat in the front row. Thomas barely glanced at him. The reception began, and the ballroom filled with laughter and music. Champagne flowed, the band played and people danced. Richard sat at a table near the back, watching his daughter smile, watching her dance with her new husband. He felt out of place, like a shadow in a room full of light. Then came the moment when Thomas stood to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about how lucky he was to have found Emily, how she had changed his life. The guests applauded, and Thomas raised his glass. To my beautiful wife, he said. Everyone drank. Richard stood as well, his glass shaking slightly in his hand. He was not planning to give a speech, but something inside him made him want to say just a few words. He cleared his throat, and the room quieted. I just want to say, Richard began, his voice soft, that I am proud of my daughter. She has worked hard for everything she has, and she deserves all the happiness in the world. Thomas, I hope you will take care of her the way she deserves to be taken care of. The room was silent. Thomas's face hardened. Richard continued, and I want to thank you all for welcoming me here today. I know I am not like most of you. I do not have much, but I have love, and I have my daughter, and that is enough for me. It was then that Thomas moved. He stepped toward Richard, his expression cold. Love, Thomas repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. Is that what you call it? You raised her in poverty. You could not even afford to send her to college without a scholarship. You wore the same clothes for years. You drove a car that barely ran. And now you stand here, in my world at my wedding, and you talk about love. Richard's face went pale. Emily stood, her voice breaking. Thomas, stop. But Thomas did not stop. He picked up his glass of wine, the deep red liquid swirling inside, and before anyone could react, he poured it over Richard's head. The wine cascaded down Richard's face, soaking his suit, dripping onto the floor. The ballroom went silent. Richard stood there, wine dripping from his hair, his hands shaking. He did not say anything. He just looked at his daughter, and in that moment, Emily saw something break in his eyes. Thomas sneered. You should have known your place before you walked into my world, old man. Richard wiped the wine from his face, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the ballroom. Emily ran after him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Dad, wait, she cried. But Richard did not stop. He walked out of the hotel, into the warm June evening, and disappeared into the crowd. Emily stood in the doorway, her wedding gown stained with tears, watching her father walk away. Behind her, the music had stopped. The guests stood in stunned silence. Thomas stood in the center of the ballroom, his face flushed, his jaw tight. Victoria approached him, her voice low. What have you done? Thomas looked at her, defiant. I did what needed to be done. That man was an embarrassment. Victoria shook her head. No, Thomas. You are the embarrassment. Emily returned to the ballroom, her face pale, her hands trembling. She walked up to Thomas, and for a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, without a word, she took off her ring and placed it on the table. Emily, what are you doing? Thomas demanded. She looked at him, and her voice was steady, even though her heart was breaking. I am leaving. Thomas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You are not serious. I have never been more serious in my life, Emily said. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, out of the hotel, leaving Thomas standing there alone. The guests began to murmur, whispers filling the air. Thomas looked around, his confidence crumbling. His mother turned her back on him. His father shook his head in disgust. And in that moment, Thomas realized what he had done. 3 months later, Thomas's world began to collapse. It started small. His business partners began to distance themselves from him. Investors pulled out of deals. The media picked up the story, the billionaire groom who humiliated his poor father-in-law at his own wedding. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire's cruel wedding stunt. Thomas Bennett, a man without honor. The public outrage was swift and unforgiving. People who had once admired Thomas now despised him. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. His company's stock began to drop. His father, Charles, called an emergency board meeting. You have brought shame to this family, he said, his voice cold. You have cost us millions in lost business. I am removing you from the board, effective immediately. Thomas tried to protest, but his father cut him off. You humiliated a man who spent his life serving others. You humiliated a man who raised his daughter with dignity and love. And for what? Because he did not wear the right suit? Because he did not have money? You are a disgrace. Thomas left the meeting in a daze. He returned to his penthouse apartment, the one he had once shared with Emily, and sat in the dark. His phone buzzed with messages, but he did not answer. He thought about Richard, about the way he had looked when the wine poured down his face. He thought about Emily, about the way she had taken off her ring and walked away. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt something he had never felt before. Shame. 6 months passed. Thomas lost everything. His position at the company, his friends, his reputation. He moved out of the penthouse and into a small apartment on the edge of the city. He stopped going to social events, stopped answering calls. He became a ghost, a shadow of the man he used to be. One cold November evening, Thomas found himself walking through the streets of a neighborhood he had never been to before. It was a poor neighborhood, the kind of place he would have avoided in his old life. He passed small houses with chipped paint, children playing on cracked sidewalks, families sitting on front porches despite the cold. And then he saw him. Richard Hayes, sitting on a bench outside a small community center. He was reading a book, his glasses perched on his nose, looking peaceful. Thomas stopped. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to turn around, to walk away, but something inside him pushed him forward. He approached slowly, his hands in his pockets. "Mr. Hayes," Thomas said quietly. Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard closed his book and gestured to the bench. "Sit," he said simply. Thomas sat, his throat tight. "I do not know what to say," Thomas began. Richard nodded. "Then maybe you should just listen." Thomas looked at him, confused. Richard took a deep breath. "Do you know what I did after you humiliated me at that wedding?" Thomas shook his head. "I went home," Richard said. "I took a shower, I changed my clothes, and I went to the community center where I volunteer. I teach math to kids who cannot afford tutors. I help them with their homework. I listen to their problems. And that night, after what you did, I sat with a young boy named Marcus who was struggling with algebra. He could not understand it, and he was frustrated, ready to give up. But I sat with him, and I showed him how to break the problem down, step by step. And when he finally understood it, his face lit up. And in that moment, I realized something." Richard looked at Thomas, his eyes steady. "I realized that my worth is not determined by how much money I have, or what kind of suit I wear, or whether people like you think I belong in their world. My worth is determined by how I treat others, by the lives I touch, by the love I give. You tried to humiliate me, Thomas. But you could not take away my dignity. Only I can do that, and I never will." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "I was wrong. I was cruel. I do not know how to make it right." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You cannot make it right with me, Thomas. But you can make it right with yourself. You can choose to be a better man. You can choose to treat people with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. You can choose to live with honor instead of pride." Thomas looked down at his hands. "I have lost everything," he said. "My business, my family, my reputation. I do not know who I am anymore." Richard placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Then maybe it is time to find out. Maybe it is time to become the kind of man who builds people up instead of tearing them down. The kind of man who understands that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in kindness, in humility, in love." Thomas broke down then, his shoulders shaking as he cried. Richard did not move. He just sat there, his hand on the younger man's shoulder, letting him grieve for the man he had been and the man he could have been. 1 year later, Thomas stood outside the same community center where he had spoken to Richard. He had spent the past year rebuilding his life, not with money or status, but with purpose. He had sold his remaining assets and used the money to fund scholarships for underprivileged students. He had started volunteering at the community center, teaching business skills to young people who wanted to start their own companies, but did not know how. He had reached out to Emily, not to ask for forgiveness, but to apologize and to tell her that he understood why she had left. She had listened, and though she did not take him back, she told him she was proud of the changes he was making. Thomas walked into the community center and found Richard in one of the classrooms, helping a group of teenagers with their math homework. Richard looked up and smiled. "Thomas," he said warmly. "Good to see you." Thomas smiled back. "Good to see you too, Mr. Hayes." Richard gestured to an empty chair. "We could use another volunteer if you have time." Thomas sat down, and for the first time in a long time he felt something close to peace. As he helped a young girl with her fractions, he thought about the man he used to be. The man who had poured wine on a good man's head because he thought wealth made him superior. And he thought about the man he was becoming, the man who understood that the greatest wealth is not what you own, but who you are. 2 years later, on a cold December evening, Thomas received a phone call. It was Emily. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "I need to tell you something." Thomas's heart raced. "What is it?" "It is my father," she said, and Thomas heard the crack in her voice. "He is in the hospital. He had a heart attack." Thomas felt the world tilt. "Is he okay?" "He is stable, but the doctors say he needs surgery. It is expensive, and I do not have enough. Thomas did not hesitate. I will take care of it, he said. All of it. Emily was silent for a moment. Thomas, you do not have to do this. Yes, I do, Thomas said firmly. Your father saved my life, Emily. He showed me what it means to be a man. Let me do this. Please. Emily began to cry. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas arranged for the best cardiac surgeon in the country to perform the operation. He paid for everything, the surgery, the hospital stay, the recovery care. And when Richard woke up after the surgery, groggy but alive, the first person he saw was Thomas, sitting in a chair by his bedside. Why are you here? Richard asked weakly. Thomas smiled, tears in his eyes. Because you taught me that family is not just about blood. It is about the people who show you who you are supposed to be. You did that for me, Mr. Hayes. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to the example you set. Richard reached out and took Thomas's hand. You already have, son, he said quietly. You already have. 6 months later, Richard stood in front of the community center, now renovated and expanded, with a new sign above the door. The Richard Hayes Learning Center. Thomas had funded the entire project, using the last of his inheritance to make sure that children in the neighborhood had a place to learn, to grow, to dream. Richard stood there, tears streaming down his face, as the community gathered to celebrate. Emily was there, her arm linked with her father's. She looked at Thomas, who stood off to the side, watching quietly. She walked over to him. Thank you, she said. Thomas shook his head. I should be thanking you. And your father. You both gave me a second chance. Emily smiled. We all deserve second chances, Thomas. The question is what we do with them. Thomas looked at the learning center, at the children running in and out, laughing and playing. I think I am finally starting to understand, he said. The wine that Thomas poured on Richard's head that day was meant to humiliate, to degrade, to remind a poor man that he did not belong. But in the end, it became the catalyst for something far greater. It became the moment that stripped away Thomas's arrogance and forced him to see the world as it truly is. A place where dignity is not bought, respect is not inherited, and the measure of a man is not what he owns, but how he treats those who have nothing to give him in return. Richard Hayes lived another 10 years after that day. He continued to teach, to volunteer, to touch lives in ways that money never could. And when he finally passed away, on a quiet spring morning, surrounded by his daughter and the community he had served, Thomas was there too. At the funeral, Thomas stood and spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Richard Hayes taught me that the greatest wealth in this world is not found in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It is found in the lives we touch, the kindness we give, and the love we share. He taught me that pride is the heaviest burden a man can carry, and humility is the greatest freedom. He taught me that a man's worth is not measured by what he has but by who he is. Thomas looked at Emily, who sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. And he taught me that forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength, the kind of strength that changes lives. As Thomas left the church that day, he thought about the wedding, about the moment he had poured wine on a good man's head. He thought about how far he had fallen, and how far he had climbed back up. And he thought about the lesson that Richard had taught him, the lesson that had saved his life. Respect is not given because of what you have. It is earned by who you are. And in the end, the man who had nothing taught the man who had everything what it truly means to be rich. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about this story? How do you feel about Thomas and what he did? If you were Richard, would you have forgiven him? And if you were in Emily's position, watching the man you love humiliate your father, what would you have done? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away? Think about the people in your life. Think about how you treat them. Think about whether you are building them up or tearing them down. Because in the end, we are all just one moment away from becoming either the man who pours the wine or the man who stands there, dignity intact, knowing that his worth cannot be taken away. Which man will you be? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of what truly matters, then share it. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this. And remember, the greatest revenge is not anger. It is becoming so much better than the person who hurt you that they cannot help but see their own reflection and feel ashamed. That is the story of Thomas Bennett and Richard Hayes. A story of pride, humiliation, redemption, and the quiet strength of a man who knew that his worth was never defined by the world's standards, but by his own.